allá de las fronteras del Estado-Nación, justo en un momento además de la emergencia del sistema capitalista moderno. Ya tenemos varios libros traducidos en castellano, están los nuestros, Villanos de todas las naciones. Está aquí también su traductora, Elena Fernández Renau. Muchísimas gracias por tu trabajo. Como decía, La hidra de la revolución y también El barco de esclavos en Capitán Swing y Entre el deber y el motín en antipersona. Hoy vamos a centrarnos en los piratas, en las piratas. Muchísimas gracias otra vez, Marcus, por estar aquí. Thank you very much. I'm only presenting the event. Y queríamos dar las gracias también a Marta Malo, que está traduciendo. La traducción será simultánea por nuestro canal de Telegram. Si no lo habéis hecho nunca, tenéis que entrar en vuestro móvil, en Telegram, al canal de la editorial Traficantes de Sueños y ahí uniros a la conversación. Con los cascos podréis oír la traducción simultánea que hará, como digo, Marta Malo de inglés a castellano. Perfecto, pues sin más voy a dar paso a la presentación. Muchísimas gracias otra vez por venir y sobre todo a Marcus.
Gracias. Thank you, Beatrice. I'm very happy to be with you again. Is Marta doing the same?
Yes.
Same kind of translation? Okay. Okay, I want to begin by thanking the translator of this book, Elena Fernandez Renan Chosas, who is here. Could you stand up? Oh, over here. Let's give her a hand. Let me tell you a story that Pablo Neruda once told. He was sitting in a room of people, all translators, and they're working on one of his poems. And at a certain point, he jumps to his feet after one of the translators has spoken. He said, "That's much better than what I wrote. Keep that. It's much better." And I don't doubt that there's some passages in this book that are better than what I wrote, so I thank you for that, Elena. I also want to thank Marta Malo again, who is translating this event. I also want to thank my publisher, Traficante de Sueños, whose labor made these books. Thanks to Pablo, to Emmanuel, to Paco, who is here somewhere, and especially to Beatrice. Because not only did she help to publish these books, she also organized a beautiful visit to Madrid for us, which included yesterday a remarkable historical tour of the city with the help of Jesus Agua de la Rosa. So thanks to you, he shared his knowledge about the history of the city, and thanks to you, Beatrice, for setting it up. A great pleasure. Okay, so here are the books. I'm going to begin by dating myself, okay? By letting you know how old I really am. I first published on pirates in 1981. 42 years ago, I published an article on pirates, scholarly article. And from the moment that article came out, my phone never stopped ringing. And that is because people around the world, in the United States and certainly elsewhere, have an obsession about pirates. It's an obsession. I don't know what else to call it. So I got calls from novelists, from filmmakers, from TV producers, artists, musicians, people who design video games, history buffs, and my favorite calls came from treasure hunters. I got a lot of calls from treasure hunters. Now, When a treasure hunter called me, I knew automatically that they hadn't read my book or even my article, because I say in the article in the book, pirates didn't bury treasure. They wanted to spend it. They wanted to live as well as they could. This idea of buried treasure was invented in the 19th century. So I knew that they hadn't read the book. So then I would have a little fun with them. I would say, yes, I have all the maps, but I'm not going to show them to you. So, to be perfectly honest, I got a little weary of all of the phone calls. I actually got tired of fielding calls about pirates. So I made the decision to write Villains of All Nations. And the idea was, I will put everything I know into this book, and this will be my swan song. This will be it. It'll be over. People write me or call me, I say, read the book. Everything I know is in the book. Just read the book. That was the purpose of this book, to try to free me from pirate lovers. But I discovered that once pirates get their hook into you, you can't ever escape. There's really no escaping it. So here we are, talking about pirates. This has been my fate. I keep talking about them. Now, I do want to say, I'm happy to say, that piracy is a thriving field for scholarly research now. There are lots of good works being done on piracy of many different kinds and many different periods of history. But that was not the case when I started working on pirates 40-odd years ago. There was almost no scholarly work on pirates, but that doesn't mean there weren't a lot of books. There were hundreds of books about piracy, but they had all been written by popular writers. And some of these popular writers did very serious research, but most of them didn't. Most of them were just really interested in the mythology of pirates, and there is quite a mythology of pirates. Most of these works treated pirates in one of two ways. They either treated them as just base criminals with bad hair and bad teeth, or they treated them as romantic upper-class heroes who had gone to sea to redeem their honor or to marry the governor's daughter or something like that. Those are very common ways that pirates are treated. Now, one of the great events in the history of writing about pirates happened in 1887 when Robert Louis Stevenson wrote Treasure Island. I don't know if any of you have read it, but I dare say you know the images that came out of that book. Captain Hook with a patch on one eye and a hook for a hand and a peg leg and a parrot on his shoulder. This has become a major cultural stereotype of pirates. Now, this is the moment when pirates entered the fantasy lives of children. After Treasure Island, there is this entire industry of producing things about pirates for children. Peter Pan would be one of the best examples. So children begin to love pirates, and this, I think, is one of the main sources of the obsession, because they get into our inner lives as children. I don't know if Halloween is practiced here in Spain. Well, if Halloween is practiced in Spain, I bet some of you dressed up as pirates at some point. I know I did. My mother has a picture of me all dressed up as a pirate. Little did I know where that would lead. We all grow up with pirates, in other words, and this is one reason why people are so extremely interested in them. But let me, before going on into some of the themes of the book, let me just talk for a minute about that image that is in everybody's head. This pirate with the patch for an eye, the hook for a hand, the peg leg, and the parrot. There is a rational basis in historical fact for that image. Because the very important social truth is that seafaring, and by the way, pirates were just common sailors. I'll say more about that in a minute. Common sailors lived very difficult lives. If you were to go into any port city in the 18th century and walk along the waterfront, you would see sailors who were beggars. Sailors who had had their hand blown off, or their eyes put out, or their leg amputated. Why was this so common? Well, you need to know the nature of naval warfare in the 18th century, in which a cannonball hits a wooden vessel, and it's an explosion of splinters. You take out your eye, a bigger chunk of wood takes off your hand, a larger chunk of wood takes off your leg. So there is a social history basis even for this image of the pirate who has clearly been severely injured at some point in his working life. Now the parrot is a little different. The parrot is a symbol of one of the features of the sailor's life, which is traveling to the ends of the earth, going to exotic places, going to the tropics, and bringing back this parrot, which is a sign that you are truly a cosmopolitan, a citizen of the world. And that's the way sailors frequently talked about themselves, as citizens of the world. Okay, so I wanted to write a history of piracy from below. On Monday night, we talked a good bit about history from below. Let me just briefly sum that up for those of you who may not have been here. History from below is a way of thinking about and writing history in which you place common working people at the center of the story. The people who are usually left out of the history books, which are almost always about the elites, the philosophers, the kings, the statesmen. That's history from above. History from below is very different. Trying to understand the lived experience of common people, and also trying to understand how those people made history, how they changed the arc of history through certain things that they did. This is a very democratic and inclusive kind of history because everyone counts. No one is excluded. And this is the kind of history that I wanted to write about pirates. Now, 2 books were very influential in my desire to do this. And these books came out right around the time I began graduate study in 1976. Some of you may know the famous British historian E.P. Thompson. Edward Palmer Thompson was one of the great historians from below. He was not an academic for most of his life, but for a few years in the 1970s, he was a professor at Warwick University in the UK, and he attracted a group of students, including my co-author Peter Linebaugh, to study with him at the University of Warwick, and they all studied similar related subjects on crime and the law. So these 2 books, Albion's Fatal Tree, Crime and Society in 18th Century England, along with Thompson's Whigs and Hunters, The Origins of the Black Act, these 2 books were the outcome of that collaboration. And here's what was so important to me about it. What they did was use legal records to reconstruct the lives of people who didn't leave any records of their own. And this, of course, is the great challenge of history from below, because ordinary working people, some of them are illiterate. Some people can't leave any records of their own. So the question is, how do you find sources? So I read these books. I thought this approach was really valuable. And so I began to look for a research subject in which I knew there would be significant legal documentation. And that's when I picked pirates. Because I knew there were a lot of legal documents about pirates. Because every time a gang of pirates was captured, they would be taken into a port city and there would be a big show trial. Big show trial. The whole port city would be wild with excitement about this. And then there would be a hanging in which either hundreds or thousands of people would show up. Ministers would write pamphlets about the pirates. In some cases, they would go and interview them in jail. Government officials wrote all kinds of documents about pirates because they were a very big problem for the empires of that time. So what I wanted to do was to use this various kind of documentation, legal, political, and there were also popular writers who were producing books about pirates during the time when they were still active. But notice, these are elite sources. These are usually not sources from the point of view of the pirates. So this then leads to one of the big challenges of History from Below. How do you read elite documents? Documents produced literally by the enemies of these people. How do you read those to make them disclose secrets about the people that you want to study? So you have to read, as some people call it, against the grain, or you have to read between the lines. And E.P. Thompson himself had a very interesting way of referring to this. He said, to write history from below, we take the documents and we hold them up to a satanic light and we read them backwards. Now, this is a reference to witchcraft, as you know, because witches were said to be able to read backwards. And I think what Edward was saying is that witches make the best historians. So you've got to make the documents give up their secrets. And I found that this was not really very hard to do because there was an awful lot of material about these pirates. So, to write a history of piracy from below, how would one do that? Well, I had 3 simple questions, very simple questions that I wanted to answer in my research. The first question was, who were the pirates? Who were they? Where did they come from? What had been their experience before they became pirates? Secondly, what did they think they were doing? What did piracy mean to them? What was their idea of piracy? And then third, why did they do it? Why did they put their lives at risk? Because most everybody who became a pirate in the 18th century knew that there was a very good likelihood they were going to be hanged for it. So why be willing to do that? What's your motivation? Those were the things those are the questions I wanted to answer, and they led me to a new social interpretation of piracy. Okay, so let me give you a brief overview of the golden age of piracy. This is something that's frequently used. The golden age is actually used in the titles. Edad de oro. The golden age of piracy begins roughly in 1660 and goes on until around 1730. So it's a period of about 70 years. This is the period where pirates have the greatest global impact of any period in history. Now, of course, piracy is ancient. I mean, it goes back to the earliest recorded documents of China or Greece. Whenever there are wealthy vessels at sea, poor people try to get some of that wealth. So it goes on for a very long time, and it still goes on today in places like the Straits of Malacca, off the coast of Somalia. There are still piracies taking place today, and they have a lot of things in common. A few years ago, when there were a great many piracies off the Somalian coast, I kept getting calls from journalists. And what those journalists really wanted me to say was that these pirates today were nothing like those pirates of the Golden Age. Right? They wanted to keep the sort of, romantic memory of those people. And I said, they're basically the same thing. They're just poor people. So this Golden Age. Within the Golden Age, there are 3 distinct generations of pirates. They're not all one sort of homogeneous mass. In the 1660s and 1670s, you have a group called the Buccaneers. This actually comes from the French word boucan, in which these pirates would capture wild cattle on Caribbean islands and set up a way of roasting the meat that was called a boucan, and then they became buccaneers or boucaniers. The leading figure in this generation was a man named Henry Morgan, who was so successful as a pirate that he became the lieutenant governor of Jamaica. Now, the object of the pirates in this period was the gold and silver fleets of Spain. That was the big prize. If you could capture those ships, then you certainly were going to get very rich very quickly. But these buccaneers also developed practices of raiding port cities and carrying away as much wealth as they could. Morgan, as I say, was probably the best example of that. And there's also a fascinating book written by a pirate named Alexander Exquemelin, who was Dutch, called The Buccaneers of America, published in 1678. This is one of the first really popular books, went through many editions in many different languages because already people were hungry to learn about these people, these pirates. So that's the first generation, the Buccaneers, active in the 1660s and the 1670s. Another generation of pirates emerges in the 1690s. If the first group was based primarily in the Caribbean, which they were, the second group was based more in the Indian Ocean. Now, there are 2 famous pirates from this generation. One is a man named Henry Avery, who captured the treasure fleet of the Mughal of India in 1694. This was a spectacular hoist of wealth. And the remarkable thing about Henry Avery is that he got away with it. Despite one of the first global manhunts in history, Henry Avery was never found. People don't know where he went, but he got away with it. And this too captured the popular imagination. That this guy, he was also known as something of a Robin Hood type character. Seize from the rich, give to the poor. A second figure in this generation is Captain William Kidd, who began his sailing life as a privateer, which is basically a legal pirate who has permission from the king to attack the king's enemies. But William Kidd, once he got into the Indian Ocean, decided to attack anyone he wanted to, which caused his wealthy backers back in London to say, oh no, we're not supporting this anymore. So they basically threw William Kidd over the side of the ship, so to speak, metaphorically, and William Kidd, even though he had the backing of these high-level merchants, was hanged in London in 1701. This signaled a turning point. England had benefited hugely from these attacks on the wealth of Spain. But now these pirates were interfering with the British Empire, with the orderly operation of trade, and that would not be tolerated. So this is a turning point. After the pirates of the 1690s, the British government says no more. We will tolerate piracy no more. And then comes the third generation. This generation begins in roughly 1716, after the War of Spanish Succession ends. And this goes on for about 10 years to around 1726. This is the generation that I study. And this is the generation that produces the symbolism that we have today of pirates. They're the ones who produced the black flag with the skull and the crossbones. They really captured a lot more than just ships. They captured the popular imagination. Lots of works are done about these people. Now, something you need to know. This generation did not include elites like William Kidd, did not include any big merchant backers. This generation was basically made up of poor working class sailors. Wealthy people no longer had any control over it, and this is one of the things that made them furious. So, to give you the examples of two people from this time period, one of the most famous is a man named Edward Teach, better known as Blackbeard. In a time when the average man was about 5 feet 6 inches tall, William Teach was around 6'9". And he had a big mane of black hair and a bushy black beard that grew from his eyes all the way down. He was an unbelievably intimidating figure. And when he went into battle, he would take sparklers and stick them in his hair and his beard in order to make the people he was chasing think that he was Satan. He deliberately cultivated this satanic imagery. And believe me, if you saw someone like that, you would be terrified. Okay? So he's a leading figure, but actually even more important to this generation is a pirate that you've probably never heard of. His name is Bartholomew Roberts. Bartholomew Roberts was the most successful pirate of this generation. He captured more than 400 ships. He had a flotilla of vessels. He had hundreds of pirates sailing under his black flag. He was a really powerful figure. So we'll come back to what happens with Black Bart Roberts, as he was called. He was a Welshman, and he was a dandy. He loved dressing up in fancy clothing, like a red silk coat, and he'd frequently have a red feather in his cap. Okay? You'll see an image of him in a few minutes. Okay, so now let's talk about the social world of these pirates. And let's go back to that question, who were they? And why were they willing to join up? This is all very simple, folks. I've already told you. They were common, exploited, working sailors. Ordinary working sailors who had really difficult lives as working sailors. This you need to understand. The life of the common sailor in the early 18th century was really, really hard. That's because they labored on ships in which the captains of these vessels had unlimited power to do whatever they wanted. The power to discipline. Captains routinely flogged their sailors. And here you have an image of it, of a sailor being flogged, literally by a cat o' nine tails. I don't know if you can see it, but the cat o' nine tails was the preferred whip of ship captains in that era. It had 9 different strands with knots on the end of each one. Sometimes wire was threaded through. The point being, literally, not only to administer a blow, but to rip the skin off the back. This was very common. And a lot of sailors had scarred backs. Now, what's fascinating is that they turned this violent punishment into a badge of honor. They called those scars on their backs tiger stripes. Tiger stripes. And they would say, yeah, I got this when I rose up and beat up Captain Skinner several years ago. And then his fellow sailors would cheer him. Yeah, you did the right thing. But this was a very important part of the social reality of the deep sea sailing ship, either the naval ship or the merchant ship. And these captains were tyrants. I don't know how better to put it. They were tyrannical. They had extreme power. Okay, but this is not the whole of the social life, the tyrannical power of the captain. The working conditions were horrible. The wages were low. Sailors made very little money. The food on board these vessels, which are at sea for long periods of time, I leave it to your imagination as to how that food would, this is before refrigeration, right? Sailors used to talk about the biscuit or the bread that they would have. They'd say, it has so many insects in it, it can walk around by itself. One sailor used to say, so what if we rise up in mutiny? Our bodies won't weigh enough to hang us. Because they were, as they put it, pinched in their provisions. Many of these vessels had adequate provisions, but the captain would sell off the good food and make money and leave terrible food or very little food for the common sailors. So low wages, terrible food, harsh discipline. I've already mentioned the flogging. And one result of all this is that common working sailors didn't live very long. I mean, we can't really study this statistically, but having studied sailors for most of my life, I would guess that if you went on board a merchant or naval ship, there's a pretty good chance you were going to be dead in 7 or 8 years. You might be swept overboard in a storm. You might be beaten to death by the captain. I read a lot of legal cases about sailors who were literally beaten to death. It happened a lot. I'll just give you one example of this. When I first got to London in 1979 to do research, I'm reading records of the High Court of Admiralty, and they bring me a big box of documents. And there's a big stack of documents, trial records, and lying on top of this stack is this long black something or other, about an inch thick. It's like this. I don't know what it is. So I just pick it up, put it aside, and I start reading the first case. First case was a man, I think his name was Thomas Baker. He was suing his captain who had beaten him so badly that he could no longer work as a sailor. And what did the captain beat him with? An 18-inch piece of rope. And that black thing was the piece of rope which he brought as evidence to show the judge. The blackness of the rope was his dried blood. You talk about an electrifying moment in the archive in which suddenly the sailor's life became terrifyingly real to me. I mean, I was just stunned. I couldn't. There it is. There's this black piece of rope that this captain almost killed the sailor with. So I never looked at documents the same way after that. When I read about these beatings, I thought of that rope. So how did one become a pirate? There were basically two ways. You could join up in a mutiny on board your ship. In other words, the sailors could come together on the lower deck and decide that they were going to rise up and dispossess the captain of his command. That happened many times. But the second way that you could become a pirate, which was actually much more common, was that when pirates would take a prize ship, they would go aboard and they would ask the sailors if they wanted to come back with them on pirates. And let me talk first about the mutiny, okay? One of the ways that that sailors organized mutinies was through something called the round robin. The round robin was basically an instrument of protest in which usually the sailors would draw a circle in the middle and they would write down in the middle what they wanted the captain to do. It was a petition or a demand that something be changed. And then they would write their names from the middle out. And the reason for that was because it would not be clear to the captain what was the beginning of the list and what was the end, which meant that there would be an equalization of risk. And this is actually one of the dynamics of life among sailors. Equalization of risk. Let's all bear the risks equally. Now, I have to point out something kind of funny. This round robin was actually done by soldiers on the coast of South Africa, I think in 1736, and they didn't know what they were doing. They weren't these sort of sailors who knew. Somebody had heard about the idea. But if you look at this, you can see exactly who was the first person who signed and who was the last. Here's the first. It goes all the way around. They got more people than they thought. And it comes down to the end. Nobody is going to be fooled by this. And so what's the captain going to do? He's going to take the first 5 names and he's going to flog them. He might even execute them. Right? But this is kind of a fascinating document that tells you something about the culture of common sailors. So that's the round robin. Let's talk now about how people joined up from a prize vessel. Okay, so here's the deal. A pirate ship is chasing a prize vessel. At some point, the black flag is raised. The captain of the vessel being chased has got to make a choice. What am I going to do? Most captains decide they're just going to surrender. And this was smart. You know why? Because if you fight back, if you say, take your cannon and you aim it at the pirates, you try to get into, they're going to beat you. Their ships are faster. They've got a lot more people on board. The pirates are supremely skilled as sailors. They can maneuver those ships. They're going to get you. And if you happen to kill some of them before they capture you, they're not going to be in a good mood when they come on board your ship. So the smartest thing to do was just to give up. And most people did. But that's where it gets interesting. What the pirates do is they send over a boarding party. Usually it's about 20 people in one of the ship's boats. Every ship has smaller boats that are used for purposes like this. 20 or 25 people, pirates, come on board. And they come on board the vessel, and they don't immediately start plundering the vessel like you might expect them to. What do? They call all of the sailors and the captain up on deck. And the captain is now the prisoner of these pirates. And what they do is really fascinating. They enact a drama. They've got the captain. They're all standing there. They're all armed to the teeth. Right? They've got daggers and pistols and guns. They are tough characters. And so the quartermaster, who is one of the leaders among the pirates, takes charge of this situation, and he goes to the sailors on this man's ship and says, "How does your captain treat you?" Well, this, folks, is a moment of truth. Because if the sailors say, "Our captain is a son of a bitch and he treats us very badly. He gives us terrible food. He bilks us of our wages, and he flogs us all the time. Well, that captain is in a lot of trouble because those pirates had experienced that same reality when they were working sailors. So what are they doing now? They are the avengers for the common sailor. They would then tie that captain up in the same place where that captain administered lashings, floggings, and they would give him the whipping of his life. And they might actually execute him, depending on how badly he treated the crew. There was one pirate, a man named Philip Line, who I think, this man was so full of rage against ship captains. When he was on the gallows, he bragged that he had killed 27 captains of vessels. Bragged about it. But it also worked the other way. If the sailor said, our captain is a decent man, he treats us well, I came across numerous instances in which the pirates just gave him his ship back and left. In one instance, they actually gave the captain some money and said, take this back to the rich merchants of London and show them what happens when a captain treats his crew well. Again, they're trying to intervene in the lives of these common sailors. Now, if you're a common sailor and you said bad things about your captain, you'd better go with those pirates when they leave, because the captain will give you the beating of your life. So then they say, okay, at the end of this little drama, they say, okay, men, who's coming with us? And quite a number of people were glad to join the pirates. This is how they recruited. And then what would happen is, as you capture more and more prize vessels, and as more and more people join up, the pirate crew gets too large for that ship, so the next time they catch a prize vessel, they take the ship, put the captain in a boat, and split the crew, so now you have two pirate vessels sailing together, frequently a stronger force. So these are the two ways you became a pirate, either through mutiny or by joining up from a prize vessel. Now, the social profile of pirates. They were relatively young men, mostly men. Actually, I found 4 women who were pirates. I'll say more about that in a minute. I think there were a great many more, by the way, because a lot of women in this era dressed as men and went to sea. They were young, averaged 27 years old. They had been at sea for a while, most of them. They were poor, dressed in rags usually, and they were international. They were a motley crew. They were from all different parts of the Atlantic. They were multi-ethnic and they were multiracial. There were a lot of black pirates. Now, sometimes merchants who were captured by pirates, who then got their vessels back, would go into port and write something in the newspaper, was captured by Edward Teach's ship. He had 30 white sailors and 30 black sailors. That kind of description is very, very common. And so they are a motley crew. You might ask yourself, why would a person of African descent want to join a pirate crew? And conversely, why would a pirate crew that was mostly European and white want to receive them? Well, first of all, many of the people who became black pirates were runaways from the plantation system. So they needed protection. They wanted to be under arms. From the pirates' point of view, what they wanted was 2 things. They wanted people who would be loyal to the enterprise. And I can't think of many people who'd be more loyal than a runaway slave. And secondly, they wanted people who knew how to fight. And a lot of the people who were enslaved in West Indian plantations were trained warriors back in West Africa. So they were fighters. And you actually see the importance of this. There are frequently a number of black pirates in the boarding parties. These are highly trusted positions. So you go on the ship and you enact the drama, then you plunder what you want and you go away. There are quite a number of black pirates who are involved in this. Okay, so here comes the big question. Once the pirates had their own vessel, what did they do with it? They all had maritime experience of how vessels were organized. Naval ships and merchant ships. Those were very hierarchical social systems. So a fairly logical thing would be that the pirates would organize their ships more or less the same way and just go about their business using the previous models that were in their heads. But that's not what they did. That's not what they did at all. They completely reinvented how you sail a ship. And this to me is the most powerful thing about this social experiment. First of all, the pirates created articles. They were called articles of agreement. It's like a constitution. These articles of agreement spell out all the rules that this ship is going to follow, and it depends on the consent of every person. In other words, you have to sign the articles even if you can't sign your name. I've seen these articles and they have lots of X's on them because a number of sailors are illiterate. So you have to agree to how things will be done. Okay? How are things going to be done? The first thing and the most important thing they're going to do is reduce the arbitrary power of the captain. Pirate ships do all kinds of things to make sure that what they experienced on those merchant and naval ships is not going to happen on their vessels. So how do you do that? It's kind of a fascinating question. How do you actually limit the tyranny of a ship captain? Well, one thing that they specify in the articles is that the crew, not the captain, will decide on all punishments. The captain will not decide alone who will be punished and who will not. So collective decision-making is now lodged in the crew. And this is important. Next thing they do, they elect their captain. Now, I want you to know, this is in like 1720, right? Poor people don't have the right to vote anywhere in the world. Anywhere. But here they are practicing democracy on board this ship in the middle of the ocean, deciding that they're going to elect their captain. Now, you're going to elect a captain, you got to elect somebody who knows navigation, right? There are certain requirements. You can't just elect anybody. But they elected the captain, and they elected all of the other officers. The selection of the officers was in the hands of the collective. One right they reserve to themselves. If they don't like what the captain does, they have the right to remove him at any time. All it takes is a majority of the crew to say, we don't like this guy. There was one removal I remember. They said this captain was acting, quote, too much like a gentleman, end quote. And they didn't like that. They wanted a tough, up from the bottom sort of sailor to be their captain. So they elect their captain, and then they do something else which I think is really fascinating. This is very innovative. I've already mentioned the ship's quartermaster, okay? This is a special position created by the pirates. And the quartermaster has several jobs. This person is also elected. The main job of the quartermaster is to keep an eye on the captain, and make sure he doesn't abuse his authority. The quartermaster is like the tribune of the people, right? Representing the people in the face of power. But the quartermaster also does something else. The quartermaster is the one who divides up all of the loot. And here is a very important part of piracy, which is linked to their ability to recruit people. On a naval ship, the ship captain will make 100 times as much in wages as the poorest sailor. On a merchant ship, it'll be less, maybe 15 to 20 times. Pirates abolished the wage. They don't consider themselves to be wage laborers. They are risk-sharing partners. The captain gets 1.5 shares. The poorest sailor on board gets 1 share. That is a radically compressed hierarchy. This is in the interest of the common sailor. This is what is going on. And the quartermaster is empowered to make sure that everything is divided up equally. Okay? Now, it's also made clear in the articles that the sovereign power on board the ship is the crew. And they create an institution by which their sovereign power will be known that is called the council. This is actually a naval term where all the officers of the ship will get together to decide on some important issue. Pirates democratized that custom and made the council a meeting of everybody on board the ship. If you want to decide where you're going to sail, if you want to decide what to do about someone who's committed an infraction, if you want to decide what to do about any issue whatsoever, you call the whole crew together and they debate. They debate and they decide collectively. This is like nothing else anybody has ever seen. Another thing that the articles do is they create a social security system for the pirates. It's like a little miniature welfare state. Remember the missing hand and the missing leg and the missing eye? The articles say if you lose an eye in battle, you get X amount of gold. If you lose a hand, you get X amount of gold or silver. If you lose a leg, you get this. They're trying to care for these injured people in a time before any of the navies of the world had that provision. So I find this to be a really fascinating consciousness of the people that you work with. I should also mention, I think it is highly significant that these articles, which regulate social life on board the ship, all aspects, say nothing about sexual practices. There's not much evidence about it, to be honest, but there is no doubt there were a wide variety of sexual practices at sea. And this is actually true on all ships, not just pirate ships. But on the other ships, you would be punished for it. There's no evidence that anyone would be punished for that sort of thing on a pirate ship. So what we have really is a place of quite extreme freedom. Extreme freedom. It's under the black flag. It's a kind of anarchy in which every person is free, within limits, to do what they want as long as they don't endanger the ship and the crew in general. It's a remarkable social experiment in democracy and equality, all from below. Some people say it's utopian, but it's not utopian because utopia means no place. It's real. It happened. We know it happened. We have a lot of evidence that pirates ran their ships in this way. And they did it all with a lot of humor. Pirates had what we might call gallows humor. I'll give you a couple of examples. One was they captured a ship, and it just so happened that on board that ship there were boxes of royal proclamations against pirates. And so as they're leaving, the pirates say, come on, give us those boxes. And the captain is puzzled. He said, why would you want those boxes with declarations about pirates? And they said, we need toilet paper. They're going to use the king's proclamation as toilet paper. The symbolism of this is not lost on them. And then another kind of funny but also kind of complicated thing that they say is, let us have a merry life and a short one. They knew as common sailors they might not live very long anyway. They knew that as pirates there was a good chance they'd get captured and hanged, but they said, let us live while we can. It's better to live as a truly free person on the ship that we designed for 2 or 3 years rather than to be beaten like dogs by these ship captains. So to them, the freedom was worth it. It was worth the risk. That's why they were willing to do it. And this was embodied in their flags. On the left here we have Edward Teach, the notorious Blackbeard. And on the right you have his flag. Now, quite a few pirate flags had not just a skull and crossbones, but an entire skeleton. And both of them were symbols of death. Symbols of death. So the pirate flag actually had 2 different meanings. This is called the banner of King Death. When a black flag with a skull and crossbones or something like this is raised so that the prize vessel can see it, it has one very clear meaning. It means, surrender now or we will kill you. They didn't usually kill people, but it was a threat. Right? That's a clear, straightforward meaning of this flag. But this flag has other meanings too. And what you'll notice in this particular image, you'll see that there is, in the right hand of the skeleton, there is an hourglass. In the left hand of the skeleton, there is a dart or a spear. And that spear is puncturing a human heart, out of which flow 3 drops of blood. My interpretation of this flag is that its images, death, violence, in limited time, speak precisely to the situation in which common sailors found themselves on board those merchant and naval ships. So there's this ironic inversion. They create the banner of King Death, and they sail under that banner of King Death so that they may live life under the Jolly Roger. This stuff is socially complicated. Okay, let's talk about the war against the pirates and how it all came to an end. Here's Black Bart Roberts, that dandy that I mentioned. And he is depicted with his flotilla of pirate ships, and you can actually see 2 black flags here. And they've got skeletons, full skeletons like Blackbeard. And here's Black Bart Roberts on the coast of West Africa, where he is severely disrupting the slave trade, which causes London merchants to go to the Parliament and to the Royal Navy and to request a flotilla of naval men of war to go to West Africa to clear Roberts and these pirates out. Now, you got to bear in mind, these pirates have created a crisis in world trade. They've captured thousands of vessels. This is major crime against merchant property, and it's seen to be damaging to the interests of the various empires, British, French, Dutch, Spanish, and all the rest. They create a crisis. They disrupt trade, as Roberts is being pictured as doing right here. In the case of Roberts, that flotilla arrived on the west coast of Africa. They came up against Roberts, and there was an unfortunate aspect of the extreme freedom of the pirate ship that came into play. When the naval convoy arrived, the pirates were all drunk. This meant they could not mount much of a defense. So they were captured. Roberts was killed in action, and 52 people were taken ashore in West Africa and hanged. This is the beginning of the end. Roberts was the most powerful of pirates. The defeat of Roberts in 1722, that was sort of the beginning of the end. So now a campaign of extermination is led by Great Britain and France for both the attacks on merchant property, but also because of the subversive example of how the pirates were running their ships. This is a set of ideas that the ruling classes of the day did not want to become well known, that you could run a ship in a different way. And subversion on board these pirate ships took many forms. So let me introduce you to Anne Bonny and Mary Read, two women pirates, as rugged as you will ever meet. I'll just give you one quick story about each one. Mary Read fell in love with a fellow pirate on board her ship, and that pirate then got into a fight with another male pirate, and that male pirate challenged her lover to a duel. Pirates would take their duels off the ship. So they scheduled their duel, and Mary Read says to herself, that guy's going to kill my lover. So what does Mary Read do? She picks a fight with that same rugged pirate, challenges him to a duel, and schedules it 1 hour before the other duel. She goes ashore and she shot him dead right on the spot and saved her lover. And then there's Anne Bonny. You need to know that when the captain of their pirate ship, a man with the great name Calico Jack Rackham, when he was captured, he and almost all of the male pirates were drunk, and when they saw the naval vessel come into view, they ran down into the hold to hide. Mary, Anne, and one other male pirate stayed on the main deck to operate the cannon to try to keep that capture from happening. They failed. They got captured. They were taken ashore in Jamaica. They had a trial. They were all condemned to die. Mary and Anne were not executed because they were both pregnant. They pled their bellies, as it was called. They would have their babies and then they would be executed. This was the idea. Mary Read, it turns out, died in prison. Anne Bonny somehow got away. We don't know how exactly. But when the time for the hanging came, Calico Jack and I think 11 or 12 other pirates are marched to the gallows, and Anne and Mary are brought out to see them. And when Jack has this noose around his neck, he looks imploringly at Anne for sympathy. And Anne's response was, in a very loud voice, "Jack, don't look at me like that, because if you had fought like a man, you wouldn't now be hanged like a dog." Anne Bonny was a pretty tough character. Anne Bonny and Mary Read were very famous in their day, and because of their exploits as pirates, a Dutch artist produced an allegory of piracy on the left here, in which a bare-breasted woman with the Jolly Roger above her head figures all around her. This is an allegory of piracy, and it takes a female form. Now, I've argued that this is the basis for Delacroix's famous painting, Liberty Leading the People. And I went out and read all of the art scholarship, and just look how similar they are. They're unbelievably similar, and it is known that Delacroix would study engravings and prints as he was thinking about the composition of a work of art, to sort of put the structure in place. So you've got the bare-breasted woman. Again, it's a working class woman in both cases with muscular arms, right? People were scandalized when they saw Delacroix's painting. They said, she must be a fishmonger or something. That's not the delicate image of female beauty that we want. But you've got the flag. You've actually got a burning ship in the background here and burning buildings here. You've got bodies strewn below. You've got the people in the background. And then I found some really important evidence that in the Salon of 1830, Delacroix submitted another painting. And this painting, we know, can prove that piracy was on his mind. The title of that painting was The Corsair. Turns out there was a French edition of the Dutch book with this illustration, which I am pretty sure that Delacroix said. So here is gender subversion. Here is the circulation from low culture at sea to the highest culture of Europe. This is one example of how history from below works. You can understand things in new ways. But of course, most pirates were hanged. This is Steed Bonnet in South Carolina, Charleston, South Carolina in 1719. Notice the sailors looking on from the vessels behind. But what's fascinating about these executions, and there were hundreds of them, hundreds and hundreds of them, is that the sailors used this occasion and the big crowds to make one last strong plea for their cause. And I give you the example of a man named William Fly, who was hanged in Boston just like this in 1726. He got up on the stage, the gallows stage. The hangman put the noose around his neck. He took it off. He said, "That you don't know how to tie a proper noose." Sailors knew how to tie. He retied the noose and put it back on his head. And then he looked out at the audience where all these ship captains, and he said, "I just want to give you a warning. You treat us very badly. You treat us like dogs. And as long as you do that, we're going to keep turning pirates and we're going to keep fighting back." He was defiant to the bitter end. And lots of pirates were like this. So, as long as there are rich men and injustices in the world, I think we will always love pirates. And it's true that pirates lost the battle. They were hanged in great numbers. But I think they won the war, because here we are talking about them and not about the people who hanged them. We're much more fascinated by them. So their advice, I'm sure, to you would be in the famous words of Public Enemy, fight the power. Thank you.
Vamos a abrir un turno de palabras para reflexiones, preguntas, aportaciones. Está mi compañero Paco con el micrófono. Por aquí.
Hola. Well, thanks very much for your presentation. I'm very fan of your work, and actually have now that I have the opportunity to throw you a few questions. Only 3 quick ones.
Only 3. Okay, good.
Yeah.
Luego te traduces también para el resto.
Okay. Sí. First one. In one of your books, translated into Spanish, class struggle on the open seas between duty and mutiny, as is translated into Spanish. If I'm not wrong, you said that ships, vessels, merchant vessels, already in the early modern ages, were the first capitalist factories in terms of wage labor, if I'm not wrong. Could you expand a little bit about this? Then second one, you've been talking about piracy and pirates in the Atlantic Ocean, but how about pirates in the Southeast Asia? I mean, do they belong to the same pattern, or are they really, profoundly different? And finally, what sources and evidence did you find to learn about decision-making and life in pirate ships? Thank you.
Thank you.
Ahora en castellano sí, por eso no hace falta, está traduciendo Marta, pero yo creo que para descanso, si es posible hacerlo así, también estaría bien la siguiente.
Básicamente en uno de sus...
Ahora creo que no, porque lo ha traducido ella, pero si hay más intervenciones estaría bien. Gracias.
Sí, muchas gracias, enhorabuena por la exposición que ha resultado muy interesante. Querría que me confirmas lo que has hablado del sistema de explotación de los capitanes, de la comida de los marineros, si esto se daba también en las naves militares o había más control y se daba menos, si participaba de este sistema...
Army vessels was the same exploitation by captains to the sailors, or was more concentrated, the food, the wages.
Among soldiers.
Yes, soldiers
Okay.
were.
Y luego en este, vamos a decir, robo que hacían los capitanes, ¿qué pasaba con los oficiales? ¿También participaban, eran víctimas o eran colaboradores del capitán en el robo de los marineros?
Como los cargos medios.
Sí, los que eran segundos oficiales, no sé, los oficiales que habría.
Right. Officers. Okay.
Y la última, cuando dices que interfirieron mucho en el comercio de esclavos, ¿qué hacían con los esclavos que capturaban? ¿Los vendían? ¿Los liberaban? ¿Qué pasaba?
Okay. Okay. Any other?
We can go for that.
Shall I answer? Okay. Okay, yes, thank you for these three good questions. Yes, I did argue in this book that you referred to that ships are one of the earliest factories in this sense. Wage laborers are brought aboard and organized into cooperation in relationship to a complex machine. One of my arguments is that the deep-sea sailing ship is the most important machine to the rise of capitalism, because without it, there's no global market. So these sailors are brought together, as they will be in factories in the future. They are subjected frequently to harsh discipline. Their cooperation is commanded, and they develop their own forms of resistance to what is going on there. So what interests me about this is that the division of labor on board a ship is very much like a division of labor in a factory. You have management, you have captains, you have a middling level of authority, including what are essentially the foremen, and then you have this mass of people who do the work and who have to cooperate in order to make that happen. And I would also just mention that the ship is literally the root word of factory, because in West Africa, they would frequently run a ship aground, and a merchant, who was at that time called a factor, would conduct business on board that ship, and that ship would be called a factory. So there's a literal truth to the ship as factory. In terms of pirates in Southeast Asia, this is a massive outburst of piracy in the late 18th, early 19th century, in which the numbers completely dwarf the numbers of pirates in the Atlantic earlier in the century. Are there connections between these two traditions? I don't know. I'm sure that there were English pirates in the Chinese maritime world, but no one, as far as I know, has been able to find any specific connections. But yes, it is a massive, massive issue in Southeast Asia, so you're right about that. In terms of decision-making on board pirate ships, it turns out that the best evidence that we have for this are letters and sometimes memoirs and sometimes published tracts of ship captains who had been captured by pirates. So they comment on how the pirates run the ship. And of course, in their view, the way pirates run the ship is complete disorder, right? Complete disorder. That's not the way a ship is supposed to be run. So they complain about the fact that the captain on the pirate ship has no power. To a merchant or naval captain, this is unheard of. How could you have a captain who has no power? So there actually is a lot of commentary about this and the ways in which the pirate ship was so different and so appalling to these captains who see the traditions of the way ships are usually run, not only dishonored, but subverted. Okay, so soldiers. I think soldiers are a fascinating comparative case. And I would argue that just as capital and labor met on board ships in this era, the 16th, 17th, 18th century, capital and labor also met on the battlefield. That there are ways in which the organization of military labor, okay, so sailors are seafaring workers, soldiers are just landed military workers. There's actually some very good work being done on this subject right now, especially by a historian named Peter Way, W-A-Y. And just to give proof of the connection, you've probably heard of the industrial process named for Frederick Winslow Taylor, an industrial process called Taylorism, in which component parts of the production process are broken up and then performed by different people so as to increase productivity. The very first treatises of that kind were written by military men in the Netherlands, in which they began to break down the different elements of military labor so as to increase productivity in exactly the way that will be done in factories a little bit later. So there's a very, we talk about this a little bit in our book, The Many-Headed Hydra, the way in which these Dutch military manuals for dealing with the labor of soldiers is quite relevant to these larger issues that we talk about with sailors. In terms of the officers are almost always hired by the ship captain. Therefore, they tend to be loyal to the ship captain, but that's not always true. And what I found in studying mutinies is that for a mutiny to be successful, some of those minor officers need to be dissatisfied with the captain and willing to side with the crew. Especially if a mate does it, a first mate, second mate, third mate, usually somebody who knows navigation. If they defect from the captain's command, that gives the mutiny a much greater chance of success. So they're kind of in between. There's this powerful force of the captain, there's this powerful force down below, and in situations of mutiny, those lesser officers have to decide, which side are they going to be on. And they do sometimes choose for the crew. And in terms of slave ships, yes, there are instances of pirates capturing slave ships and liberating the people on board. There are also in the Indian Ocean, not so much the Caribbean and the Atlantic, pirates who become slave traders. Okay, so we need to acknowledge that because it's important. But the main reason why pirates were interested in the slave trade was they wanted to get the vessels before the vessels had brought people on board. The reason why, the average pirate crew was 80 to 90 people. The slave ships had a lot of room for people to bunk. The slave ships also had very big stores of food, which could be used by the pirates for long voyages. So what they really wanted were, and the slave ships are also pretty fast, what they wanted was the vessels, not the enslaved people. But we do know that, Blackbeard, for example, his vessel, he was called the Queen Anne's Revenge. A lot of pirates have revenge in the title of their ship. That was a former slave ship, which he had converted to his own purposes. So it's really the ship, not the slaves, that they're after. They try to capture them before they get to the West Coast and load up with human cargo.
¿Podemos coger un par de preguntas más?
Bueno, muchas gracias por compartir el día de hoy con nosotros esta exposición. Sobre lo que mencionaba de esta especie de staging teatral en los barcos, sobre cómo trataban a los capitanes, no pude evitar recordar los exabruptos que hacía Benjamin Ley cuando condenaba a los cuáqueros, ¿no? Con el trato a los esclavos. ¿Podríamos hablar entonces de estas formas dramáticas como formas de juicios y también como de comunicación política en el siglo XVIII? Me venía mucho a la mente la comparación entre ambas formas de hacer estas como actuaciones públicas, ¿no?
Un segundo. This drama thing, the about that remains him,
Benjamin Lay.
and the Quakers thing.
Right.
That, do you think it could be like a political form?
Like a political language, like a public political
language of the
language.
17th century?
Is that the end of your question?
Yeah, well, basically,
¿Algo
yeah.
más?
También sobre esta forma en la cual no había una distinción racial en las tripulaciones de los barcos piratas, ¿no entraría ahí, o bueno, qué tanto sería que compartían experiencias en común, ¿no? Sin importar esa cuestión de diferencia de origen? No hay tanto peso de la sangre, sino un peso de la experiencia de ser oprimidos, ¿no? Básicamente.
This interracial relationship between the pirates came from the experience of oppression they both lived.
Pirates and slaves.
Yes.
Okay. I love the question about political theater, which links the pirates to Benjamin Lay, who was, by the way, their contemporary and a sailor, as you know. Most people don't know it, but sailors on board deep-sea ships performed plays in their idle hours. In fact, I came across a case of a group of sailors performing Shakespeare. And Benjamin Lay may have gotten the idea for some of these plays, some of these dramatic protests, from his time as a sailor. The reference is to Benjamin Lay, who was a Quaker and one of the most militant opponents of slavery that you would ever encounter. He was one of the first people to call for a worldwide abolition of slavery, which he did in 1738. He performed guerrilla theater. Is there a term for guerrilla theater? Guerrilla theater?
Guerrilla theater, the collective, you say?
Yeah, political theater. He performed a guerrilla theater or political theater against slave owners to humiliate them in public. He would sprinkle fake blood on them to show that they were guilty of oppressing their fellow creatures. So pirates did similar things, and there's one play that we have that was actually recovered by somebody, a play that pirates performed as they were on a kind of deserted island between voyages, in which they pretended to put a pirate on trial. And what they did was they had one person dress up as a judge in the British court. He took a mop and put it on his head instead of a wig, and he took a black tarpaulin and threw it over his shoulders like he was a cape, the way the judges would dress. And they did this utterly hilarious spoof of the British legal system. And so they've got this one person there trying for piracy, and the judge is the judge decides to hang him because it's time for lunch. You know, this is kind of the way, that's the arbitrary nature of power. But I love your question, because what it gets at is the circulation of the forms of popular culture. And I think these sorts of political theater are not uncommon in this era. And whether there's a specific connection between the pirates and Benjamin Lay, I will think about that. I appreciate your question. In terms of sailors and slaves, This question has a complicated answer because the sailors who are on board slave ships, in all of my research, I have never seen them join an uprising of the slaves. Never. Including the black sailors. They think their side is with the captain. And that line between the sailors and the slaves is very heavily policed. Okay? So that's one indication. Another important thing to bear in mind, though, is that sailors, in complaining about their plight, frequently referred to themselves as slaves. And you do find acts of sympathy, acts of solidarity. I'll just give you an example from the book that I'm working on right now. The man who will become a famous black abolitionist, Frederick Douglass, is working on the docks of Baltimore. One day, he's 12 years old. He sees two Irish sailors unloading stones from a small vessel, and he just pitches in to help, probably hoping they'll give him a bit of money at the end. But when they finish the job, the sailors say to him, are you a slave? And will you be a slave for the rest of your life? And he told them that he was. And they expressed great sympathy for him. And he said, at that moment, I knew that I was going to run away. So these kinds of acts are not unknown. And then let me just say that the book that I'm writing now is how enslaved people escaped slavery by sea, by working with dock workers and market women, and especially sailors, to get on board those ships to carry them to a place in the northern United States where they would be free. So the record of solidarity between sailors and enslaved people is mixed, but it's much more common than we thought. I think that'll be one of the messages of the book that I'm writing right now.
¿Alguien más se anima?
¿Ha notado en los últimos años un aumento de la opinión antipiratas por el aumento del nacionalismo españolista?
Pero en España, entonces,
Sí.
en particular. Claro, es que a lo mejor no puede, si es en España, o a lo mejor cuentas, si quieres desarrollar la idea como para compartirla.
En los últimos años hay un revisionismo de la historia en España, especialmente protagonizado por la extrema derecha, que reivindica el imperio español.
Okay. Okay.
Esa gente es muy, bueno, actúa mucho sobre todo en redes sociales, no tanto en la academia, pero ¿ha notado que la popularidad de la piratería es menor, o de los piratas, ese mundo de los piratas es menor quizá por esto, o una suerte de rechazo?
Perhaps it's happening something similar in the state with Trump or the far right. And do you connect this rise of the far right with a change in the opinion about the pirates, like less sympathy for pirates from this rise of the extreme far right?
I haven't yet seen any revisionist views of piracy affected by a far-right ideology. And one reason for that is that far-right ideology doesn't really like history from below. They like history from above. So what they want, and this is a very big debate in the United States right now, should we have slave owners as national heroes, like George Washington and Thomas Jefferson? It's a very big debate. And the far right is furious about the suggestion that we shouldn't. Right? My argument is that, and the defense of those presidents was, well, that was just those times and everybody did that. But I'm sorry, that's not true. Let me give you the example of Benjamin Lay. And Jefferson and Washington would have known about him. Right? So not everybody believed it, not all white people believed it. Right? So what the right tends to favor are highly nationalistic accounts of traditional American heroes. I haven't come across any writing by them on pirates just yet, although they are very hostile to history from below. And right now, you'll see in places like Texas and Florida that the best research that's been done, for example, in the civil rights movement over the past 30 or 40 years, you're not to teach it. Teachers are told that they're not to teach it. So there is a very great political battle going on about history in the United States right now, and we don't know who's going to win. We don't know. That depends on political future.
Pues yo aprovecho, si no, para preguntar, porque bueno, ahora viaja a Barcelona y luego va a Holanda, y en Holanda va a participar en un congreso sobre estudios marítimos y es sobre solidaridad en el mar, ligado con la cuestión de los migrantes, ¿no? o exiliados económicos, climáticos, que huyen de sus países, ¿no? y toda la solidaridad de los barcos, ¿no? que se están luchando por recogerles, todo el conflicto que hay en el mar Mediterráneo, ¿no? por ejemplo. Entonces, bueno, le quería preguntar sobre esto. The conference you are going in Holland, it's about maritime solidarity, and it is related to actual things, no? in Mediterranean Sea, the thing of refugees and migrant people, and this, if you can explain a bit about that.
Sure. I've been working with colleagues in the Netherlands at the International Institute of Social History for many years, and we've done, I think this is our 7th or 8th conference or workshop, and the theme we chose this year was solidarity, maritime solidarity, past and present. So what we're doing is bringing in scholars who study solidarity, for example, in making unions. We have a number of union representatives who are going to be there. And people who have studied the longer term of maritime solidarity, as I've done, going back to the 18th century. And the goal is to combine or create a conversation between people who do that kind of work and people who are involved in activists in sea rescue. So we have a very large number of activists who are involved in organizations like Sea Watch, Alarm Phone, and so the point is going to be to try to see what are the circumstances in which maritime solidarity can succeed, and how can you organize solidarity over space and time. And I'm going to give a talk about this escaping slavery by sea. What does that experience tell activists in the present? What can you learn from that? And I'll just mention 2 or 3 of the points. One of them is today's activists have to be willing to break the law. That's what abolitionists did in the 19th century. Everything about slavery was legal. Anytime you helped someone who was escaped, you were breaking the law. Some people went to prison for it. Some people died in prison. Got to be willing to do that. Other things that need to be done in this kind of struggle, you need to treat the mobile people, the migrants, as sources of knowledge. You need to learn from them about the conditions that they're escaping. You need to document those conditions. You need to amplify the voice of the migrant. You need to humanize the migrant. These are all things that abolitionists did. in the 19th century. And I think they could be very useful for activists today to think about and employ. Yeah.
Podemos dejarlo aquí.